I start, I'd like to ask you to look at these two. Um, it, I think no, it's yeah, but because I think we have two mics, right? Okay. So I'd like to ask you to look at these two pics, and I'd like you to think about these questions. What is this building? What are these buildings? Where is it, or where are them? And if it represents a country, what the country will be? And we will get back to these pictures later. So the presentation really builds on the discussion of mythology and seeks to trace the links between representation, interpretation, and translation. There are due purposes to set mythology as this core theme. The first one is that the anthropologist sees myth as highly representative of cultures. They are not only stories for story's sake, but rather fundamental features of national identity. The complexity of science system inherent in mythology can help us reveal some of the features of translation deeply rooted in semiology and semiotics. I say semiology referring to Saussure's thought, and the latter semiotics referring to the ones that Peirce brought forward. So the question the talk sets to explore is, what are some of the ways myth represent the culture, and how are they interpreted? To what extent can we talk about this representation and interpretation as translation? So first, the research on myth, or we say mythology, regards myth as representations of identity of a society, and hence reads the myth as science in order to reveal its influence to the society. For the time limit, I will jump the review of literature for classic mythology researchers by, for example, Claude Lévi-Strauss and Ernest Cassirer. In short, both anthropologists see the myth as not real stories, not real referring to people's conception of them being part of a folklore, but not necessarily fake. Like in the opening of Mary Midley's Myth We Live By, she writes that myths are not detached stories. They are imaginative patterns, networks of powerful symbols that suggest particular ways of interacting the world. They shape its meaning. Myth, as symbols, shape the way we see the world. So following these threads of thought, Barthes raised examples of myth today. For instance, he wrote an example of the picture of a soldier saluting to the French national flag. And it reminds people, as Barthes argues, of French nationalism and its military history. So Barthes points out that the perception of myth as tales is largely a misused concept. He argues that myth as a speech to which we assign historical limits and reintroduce society. And these myths today are not fake. In other words, talking about myth is not limited to the discussion of stories about gods or the folklores. Rather, myth itself signals omnipresence. However, the not fake does not necessarily mean real. For myth readers, it does not matter whether it is real or not. Either way, they can understand the representation. This concept is the precondition for us to continue the discussion. So, as many anthropologists agree, myths draw on a complex science system. The call for interpretation in understanding science means that the science interpretation allows us to perceive not the pure concept, but rather the hermeneutic concept, that is the concept that is situated and that does not lift what is to be understood out of its situation, to cite from Schmidt. So Barthes, following Saussure's tradition, writes about the double-leveled science system of myth, where the sign, the signified and signifier, that is, of the first level becomes the signifier of the second. So Both uses the term sign specifically to introduce a third element into Saussure's didactic system. It is an element that indicates the correlation between the signified and signifier. And he points out that it is this third element that knows only one operation, reading and deciphering. Now, the meaning of the sign in a myth system goes beyond what Saussure's blank may refer to. It can be not only written discourse, but also photography, cinema, reporting, sports, shows, publicity. All these can serve as a purpose to mythical speech. Because the first level sign, the signifier, is filled with signified, myth has to deprive the fullness of the sign, that is, to deprive the signified from the sign, and thus making the sign into an empty signifier, and thus making the sign into an empty signifier, which Barth called a form. The form is then associated with a new signifier, the concept, making the myth filled again, as signaled by the icon you can see on the screen. So there is the twofold nature of the concept, the intentionality and historical, but due to the time limit, I will skip the discussion for now. Now, to think about myth system from semiology gives us fruitful theoretical insights, but it does not speak for the dynamics of sign interpretation. In this case, we will have to turn to Peirce for the answer. A Peirce triadic system of semiotics, as you can see the comparison here. Where the sign is consisted of a representation, an object, and a interpretant, may offer us further insights. What is important in this triad sign system is that the interpretant, as you can see in the picture, the interpretant can always become another representation and then open to interpretation again. And it refers to almost an infinite cycle of understanding of sign. So if we apply this dynamics of semiotics to Barth's mythology, we can see the myth as what Eco calls a encyclopedic representation, as you can see here. The key idea of the encyclopedic representation is that interpreters draw knowledge from their pre-existing frames. To interpret a sign, therefore, is to see the sign as a node that links an encyclopedic of knowledge together. The encyclopedic representation shows a rhizome model of knowledge, which connects any point to any other point, and its traits are not necessarily linked to traits of the same nature. It brings into play very different regions of science. So in this regard, what Eco's encyclopedia may bring to the discussion of mythology is a new reflection on Barth's structure. Barth's intention of showing a double-level sign system seems to suggest that the first level of sign representation is based on equivalence. Being translation studies scholar, we're all very aware of this phrase, equivalence. And the second on inference. That is, the first level of representation conveys meaning based on synonymy, making it a Persian icon. On the second level, the representation relationship becomes an inferential one. It depends on the frames of encyclopedic representation to make meaning. So by interpreting the icon, the interpretant turns the icon into a symbol and opens up endless rhizomatic connections linking to all possible knowledge an interpreter could have had. As we will see later, Echo goes a step further to suggest that actually the both levels are inference in nature. But let's first look at an example discussing power of photos, icons, symbols, and finally myth. So the case concerns a poster, as you can see on screen, announcing an upcoming academic event. On the poster, there is a photograph of the convention center doubling on the Liffey River, and the reflection of the convention center on the water surface is a traditional Chinese building with, as you can see, red pillars and tiles on the rooftop, so on and so forth. Now let's think about the representations involved in this poster. First of all, the representation of the doubling bit. I call it, as you can see, the icon to symbol representation. This is to say that the first representation relationship is iconic. The representation is based solely on similarity. That is, the similarity that allows the photo of convention center to represent the concept of the real convention center that makes the representation a synonym. But the icon cannot always stay as an icon once being observed. For those, remember I asked you to think about the two pictures. So for those of you who know this building, you know where it is, you know its history, you know its function. In other words, you have an encyclopedic knowledge of this center. So these previous knowledge help to construct an interpretant who translates the sign into another system of signs. Such an interpretation completes the sign as it works in the poster. So when you know where the building is, when you know what the building is, the photo is no longer the copy of the convention center. Now the sign being translated by the interpreters, it becomes more complex and more complete. I say complete because, for example, Dinda Gorley says, signs are evolutionary agents aimed at engendering interpretant signs, which evolve through time their informational content. This photo is surely a representation, but I think it's not the myth that I want to talk about here, because there is, I'd say, nothing really Irish about the building other than its location. As a result, only those who actually know the building understand the representation relationship, and hence making it less well known. And so I think that unqualifies the whole building as the not fake myth that I will talk about later. But what about the Chinese building or East Asian building even? Most people cannot give the name of the building. Even I am a Chinese. I'm not very sure where that building is, whether this picture is the same building as it is in the poster. But nevertheless, I think many people, if not all of them, can still identify it as representing China. The photo, of course, starts as an icon representing the precise building it includes in its frame. But even before us see the poster, the icon already is being translated into a symbol. So to say that it starts as an icon is to analyze the photo in very much a similar way as we have talked about for the doubling one. But what makes it different is that it soon becomes one of the encyclopedia entries referring to the representations, for example, of Chinese architecture. In short, it represents not the building itself, but a stereotype. This shift of representation makes it symbolic rather than iconic. So what this means is that without the ability to know exactly what the building is, where the building is, what the function of the building is, the viewers of the poster can still recognize the object of which this representation speaks to. Next, to serve the purpose of the poster, the sign requires further interpretation. It is thus further translated by the viewers into a new sign. This means that this sign has been translated not twice, but at least 3 times. First, from the real architect to its icon by synonymy. Secondly, from an icon to a symbol of a stereotype of Chinese or East Asian architecture by inference. And finally, from one symbol to another, connected by another inference. Different from the photo of convention center, everything about this Chinese architect is Chinese, except perhaps for the real building. I'm not suggesting anyway that this building is not in China or not built by Chinese architects, but it does not really matter. Think, for example, the Chinatown in London. We cannot deny that this type of building, or the building on the poster per se, located in China, but even if it does not, it is still largely a myth of that Far East nation. So to this end, we can think about translation in terms of modern myth. What is translation in this mystifying process? How does it work? Translation is identifiable in the model of myth because translation is part of the sign. We only need to consider the statement of translation being semiosis. You can refer to Gourlay or Murray's, for example. There could be more discussion on this aspect, but I'll skip it for now because I want to emphasize on my next point. That is, as you can see, myth today as translation. What I want to include in today's talk is that myth is translation. As noted by Andrew Berry, translation is not only a literary act, but rather a political and geographical one. This argument is a comment on Latour's actor network theory, or others call it the sociology of translation. Well, there are scholars argue that the sociology of translation, the translation bears a different meaning from the translation that we talk about in translation studies, but okay, thank you. But I hardly agree with them, and here's why. I have drawn 2 links to it. So the ANT theory, I will call it short, the actor network theory. The ANT theory argues that the information passes from actor to actor, and it changes constantly. And it refers to the change of the token entropy to explain why the information changed. But similarly, in translation studies, for example, Michael Carl has developed a system theory of translation based on the second law of thermodynamics. Copus Murray also explores the relationship between second law of thermodynamics and translation, and concludes that semiotic processes can, in theory, cause any kind of relationship between incipient and subsequent sign systems, because they are subject to both entropy and net entropy. And secondly, if we think about the network, as we stated earlier, in Eco's encyclopedic representation, interpreters, or in this sense translators, work as a node in a network of knowledge, as is understood by NT scholars. Translation means not only transmitting information, but transforming it according to their own needs. Similarly, in the encyclopedic representation, translators, when they translate, select economic amount of information from the endless network of to interpret. And if we link it back to the myth, to construct a myth, the constructor works as the node of endless network of actors, both human and non-human, relating to the represented society. Myth constructors as translators select whatever they regard as appropriate and representative. In this case, I will wrap it up very quickly. Myth as translation unavoidably involves reshaping of culture due to categorization and stereotype. Just give you several examples of the post of the Chinese building. So these are the YouTubers who come to China to travel, and you can see their cover picture are all these kind of architects. If you look at the Chinatown, you can see similar building, and even in Disneyland, you can see the buildings of this sort. So, in short conclusion, the Fisk says he wishes bots had not used the term myth because the word myth gives people the perception of made-up folklores, which are not real, judged by people today. But I think the not real perception of the term inspires me to regard the not fake representation as more than myth. The representation that are not fake are not necessarily real at the meantime. But the research can go further. I will not extend it too much. For example, on this book, it's not Chinese characters, but it looks like Chinese characters. And it leads to the research of racism as well, how people, make fun of Chinese people's look. But okay, these are all what I wanted to talk about. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.